In the autumn of 100 BC, a boy is born into a Roman family with an ancient name and empty coffers. Two things are already true about the republic he is born into. First, its constitution has spent 500 years building walls against any single man ever ruling Rome alone. Annual elected offices, colleagues who can veto each other, terms that expire, armies that answer to the Senate. Second, that same republic has just watched a general named Sulla march his legions into the city and slaughter his political enemies by the thousand, and walk away unpunished. The walls are already cracking before the boy can walk. This is the story of Julius Caesar, a man who spent his whole life finding the cracks in a 500-year-old system built to stop exactly him, and who did not live to see what his success actually built in Rome's place. Soldiers come to the house at night looking for a 19-year-old they mean to kill. Gaius Julius Caesar is not home. He has already guessed what is coming and gone to ground in the hills above Rome, moving from one hiding place to the next, sick with fever, paying off the search parties who find him anyway. His crime is his family. His aunt married a general named Gaius Marius, the great rival of the man now killing his way through Rome's political class. A general named Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla has just won a civil war and is settling it with lists. Anyone whose name appears on a proscription posted in the forum can be killed on sight. Their head brought in for a reward, their property seized. Caesar's name is not yet on a list, but his marriage has put him close enough to one that it hardly matters. Caesar's family, the Julii, claim a lineage going back to Aeneas, and through him to the goddess Venus herself, a claim that says more about the value Romans placed on ancient names than about hard genealogy. What the claim cannot hide is that the Julii have not held real political power in generations, and that the household is not rich. Caesar grows up not in some marble compound on the fashionable hills, but in the Subura, a crowded, noisy district of narrow streets, cheap tenements and working people wedged between two of Rome's grander hills. His father dies suddenly when Caesar is about 16, collapsing while putting on his shoes one morning, and the boy becomes head of the household years before he is ready for it. His mother, Aurelia, a woman later Roman writers single out for unusual strength of character, effectively raises him alone from that point, and the two stay close for the rest of her long life. He had married Cornelia a few years before, the daughter of a consul from the losing side, and when Sulla ordered him to divorce her to prove his loyalty, Caesar refused. It was a strange thing for a poor, nearly powerless young noble to risk his life over, and it is the first time the pattern shows itself. Given a choice between the safe compliance that keeps a Roman alive and the stubborn, calculated defiance that might destroy him, he chooses the defiance, and it works out. Relatives intervene. The Vestal virgins, whose word carried unusual weight even with a dictator, plead his case. Sulla relents, though later biographers say he warned the men around him that in that boy there were many Mariuses, a warning nobody in the room took seriously enough. Rome in the 80s BC is not the settled republic of memory. It has just proven, twice in a decade, that an ambitious general with a loyal army can march into the capital and rewrite the rules by force, and that the Senate cannot stop him once his legions cross into Italy proper. That fact will matter more to Caesar than to almost anyone else alive. For now he leaves Rome instead of testing it further, serving in the east with the army, earning Rome's second highest military honour, a wreath of oak leaves for saving a fellow soldier's life at the siege of a rebel city on the island of Lesbos. Sulla dies in 78 BC. Caesar comes home. He does not come home to fight, he comes home to talk. Roman politics runs on public speaking, and Caesar throws himself into the law courts as a prosecutor, going after corrupt former governors with a sharp, theatrical style that makes him more enemies than convictions but builds his name. To sharpen the skill further, he sails east again, this time to study rhetoric on the island of Rhodes under a well-known Greek teacher. He does not make it. Off the coast of Asia Minor, near the small island of Pharmacusa, pirate ships take his vessel. Piracy in this stretch of the Mediterranean has grown into something close to an organised industry, tolerated for years by a Rome distracted with its own wars, and a captured Roman noble is a valuable asset. The pirate set his ransom at 20 talents of silver, an enormous sum. Caesar, according to the story that circulated about him for the rest of his life, laughed at the figure and told them he was worth 50, then sent his own men to raise it. He spent roughly 5 weeks as their prisoner, and by every account he spent it strangely, composing speeches and poems and reading them aloud to his captors, joining in their exercises, and telling them, more than once and apparently in a tone that unsettled them, that when he was free, he would hunt them down and have every one of them killed. He was not making conversation. The ransom arrived, he was released, and he went straight to the coastal city of Miletus, raised a small fleet on his own authority, tracked the pirate ships to where they were anchored, and captured most of them. The regional Roman governor, who technically held jurisdiction over the execution of prisoners and had his own reasons for delay, sat on the decision. Caesar did not wait for him. He had the pirates put to death himself, a young man with no formal command acting as though he already had one, and Rome's bureaucracy simply absorbed it rather than punish him, because he had, after all, gotten the result everyone wanted. Two things are true of the man walking back toward Rome after that. He has already learned, twice now, that the Republic's rules bend for someone willing to act first and explain later. And Rome itself, in the background of both stories, has already shown him exactly how far that bending can go, as far as a march on the Capitol, as far as death lists in the Forum, as far as one general deciding, alone, what the law now says. Caesar has spent his youth on the receiving end of that lesson. He has not yet had the chance to use it himself. That chance is still 20 years away, and everything between now and then is the slow work of building an army, a debt, and a following large enough to make the lesson his. In 69 BC, Caesar stands in the Forum at his Aunt Julia's funeral and does something nobody has dared do in public for close to a decade. Roman funerals for the great families traditionally carried wax masks of the family's illustrious dead in procession, ancestor portraits paraded before the crowd as a reminder of the family's standing. Sulla's faction had made the wax mask of Julia's husband, the great general Gaius Marius, effectively forbidden, its display too dangerous a symbol of the losing side of the civil war. Caesar has it carried anyway. The crowd, many of them old enough to remember Marius as a champion of the common soldier and the common voter against the entrenched Senate elite, cheers. It is Caesar's first public announcement of which side of Roman politics he intends to build his career on, and it costs him nothing that year, because Sulla is dead, and the men now running the Senate are not yet ready to move against him for it. Roman political life at this level runs on two tracks that every ambitious man has to run at once. The formal track is the cursus honorum, a fixed ladder of offices, each with a minimum age and each unlocking the next. Quaestor, then aedile, then praetor, then consul, the summit held by 2 men at a time for 1 year only. The informal track is popularity and debt. Offices came with expectations attached, particularly the aedileship, whose holders were expected to fund public games and spectacles out of their own pocket in exchange for the crowd's gratitude at the ballot box later. Caesar wins the quaestorship in 69 BC, a modest first rung, then the aedileship in 65 BC, and here he does something that alarms the older, cautious men of the Senate. He spends money he does not have, staggering sums borrowed at ruinous interest, on gladiatorial games so lavish the Senate has to pass a law afterward capping how many fighters a magistrate is allowed to field, because Caesar's crowd of contestants was seen as buying the audience outright. He is, by his mid-30s, one of the most indebted men in Rome, and he treats the debt less as a burden than as a tool. A later hostile source claims he once said that he needed only 2 things, soldiers and the wherewithal to keep them paid, and that if he had those, money would find him through them rather than the other way around. Whether or not that particular remark is accurate, it captures the logic of the decade. Borrow against a future that has not arrived yet, spend it on visibility and favour now, and trust that the offices those favours buy will eventually produce the wealth to settle the books. It is a dangerous game for anyone without either an army or an extraordinarily patient set of creditors, and for now Caesar has neither, only the second thing, and only barely. In 63 BC he makes his boldest move yet. He stands for the office of Pontifex Maximus, the head of Rome's state religion, a position of enormous prestige normally reserved for the most senior, most established men in public life. Caesar is neither senior nor established. His 2 rivals for the post are older, richer, and more secure. He is said to have told his mother on the morning of the vote that he would come home either as Pontifex Maximus or not at all, meaning his debts would finish him if he lost. He does not lose. Historians still debate how heavily bribery decided the outcome, but decided it was, and Caesar moves into the office's residence on the Sacred Way, at the heart of religious and political Rome, a startling result for a man his age, and a clear signal that whatever coalition of voters he has been building in the Forum for the last 6 years is real and it delivers. That same year Rome nearly convulses. A bankrupt aristocrat named Lucius Sergius Catilina, having lost the consular election, organizes a conspiracy to seize power by force, recruiting discontented veterans and desperate debtors across Italy. The consul Marcus Tullius Cicero exposes the plot and drags several conspirators before the Senate. In the debate over what to do with the captured men, most of the chamber wants summary execution, no trial, an example made on the spot. Caesar stands and argues against it, not out of sympathy for Catiline, but on a narrower, colder point, that killing Roman citizens without trial, however guilty they plainly are, sets a precedent the Senate will regret the first time it is turned on men who are merely unpopular rather than actually guilty. Cato the Younger answers him, the Senate votes for execution, and the conspirators are strangled in a prison cell that night. Caesar has lost the vote but made his position on record, and made an enemy of Cato that neither man will ever set down. By the end of 63 BC, Caesar holds Rome's most sacred religious office, has publicly staked out a populist political identity, has spent himself into debt that could ruin an ordinary man, and has drawn the lasting suspicion of the Senate's most rigid defender of tradition. None of it yet amounts to real power. Real power in Rome still means an army, a province, and money enough to answer to no one. All three of those are still ahead of him, and the men who will help him reach them, and the men who will spend the rest of their lives trying to stop him, are already circling the same forum he has just conquered. In the summer of 60 BC, three of the most powerful men in Rome meet quietly, away from the Senate's eyes, and agree to stop competing with each other long enough to get what each of them wants. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known simply as Pompey, is Rome's most celebrated living general, fresh from crushing pirates across the Mediterranean and conquering swaths of the eastern kingdoms, and yet the Senate is stalling on ratifying the land grants he promised his veterans and the eastern settlements he negotiated. Marcus Licinius Crassus is Rome's richest man, a fortune built on real estate speculation and slave-worked mines, and he wants tax relief for the business interests he backs. Caesar has just returned from a term as governor in Spain, has won enough military credit there to qualify for a triumph, a formal victory procession through Rome, but he wants the consulship even more, and Roman law will not let him claim both a triumph and stand for office in the same window of time, so he gives up the triumph without hesitation. Individually, the three men are checked by rivals and by a Senate that fears any of them growing too strong alone. Together, pooling votes, money and popularity, none of the old checks work. Historians later name this arrangement the First Triumvirate, though no Roman at the time used that phrase or registered it as any kind of formal office. It is simply an alliance of convenience between men who understand that Rome's constitution was built to stop one man, not three acting in concert. The alliance elects Caesar to the consulship for 59 BC, alongside a staunch conservative named Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, and it is immediately clear which of the two men actually runs the year. Caesar brings forward a bill to distribute public land in Italy to Pompey's discharged veterans and to Rome's poorer citizens, funded partly by the new wealth flowing in from Pompey's eastern conquests. It is, by the standards of the time, a moderate and carefully drafted bill, reviewed and endorsed even by some conservative senators when it is first proposed. Cato the Younger opposes it anyway, on principle, filibustering with a marathon speech, until Caesar has him physically removed from the Senate and thrown briefly into custody, a shocking breach of senatorial norms that backfires by making Cato a martyr rather than silencing him. Bibulus tries a different tactic, declaring the assembly days ill-omened under religious law to block a vote by procedure, and when that fails to stop Caesar, he retreats to his house for the rest of the year, rarely appearing in public, reportedly announcing that he intended, in his words as later writers render them, to simply watch the skies for bad omens rather than govern. Rome jokes for years afterward that this was the year of the consulship of Julius and Caesar, since Bibulus has made himself so invisible that even the official record seems to belong to one man. The land bill passes by force at a public assembly, with armed veterans in the crowd and Bibulus' own attendants roughed up when they try to intervene. It is a genuine benefit to thousands of poor Romans and discharged soldiers, and it is also unmistakably government by mob pressure rather than by the Senate's ordinary deliberative process, a precedent every side in Roman politics will remember and eventually imitate against each other. Caesar follows it with further legislation, ratifying Pompey's eastern arrangements and granting Crassus tax favours, delivering on every promise that brought the three men together in the first place, and the alliance seals itself further with a marriage. Caesar's daughter, also named Julia, is given in marriage to Pompey, binding Rome's most famous soldier to Caesar's family by blood as well as by politics. Caesar himself recently divorced from his second wife over a religious scandal involving another man sneaking into a women-only rite at his house, marries a young noblewoman named Calpurnia, cementing another useful family alliance. Before his consular year ends, Caesar arranges the one prize that will define the next decade of his life: a 5-year military command over the Roman provinces of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, soon extended by a further law to include Transalpine Gaul as well, an enormous territory covering most of what is now northern Italy, the Balkan coast and southern France. On paper, it is an administrative posting. In practice, given the unstable tribal frontier just beyond Transalpine Gaul's border, it is an open invitation to make war, win plunder, and build the one thing Caesar has never had: an army loyal to him personally, blooded in real campaigns, paid from real conquest rather than borrowed money. He is by now visibly thinning at the crown of his head, a small vanity he manages by combing what hair remains carefully forward, and by seizing on every honour the Senate is willing to grant him that comes with the right to wear a wreath of laurel leaves in public, since a wreath, conveniently, covers a receding hairline as well as it crowns a triumph. It will become, over the following 15 years, one of the most recognisable things about him. At the close of his consulship, Caesar leaves Rome for his new provinces a controversial figure, adored by the crowds whose land bill he pushed through, distrusted by a Senate that watched him govern by force when persuasion failed, and now for the first time in command of real legions on a real frontier. Bibulus and Cato are still in Rome, still furious, still waiting for the 5 years to end so they can drag him back into court for how he behaved in office. Caesar is counting on the 5 years buying him enough victories, enough loyal soldiers, and enough wealth that by the time anyone can touch him again, it will already be too late to matter. In the spring of 58 BC, word reaches Caesar's new province that an entire people, the Helvetii, have burned their own towns behind them and are marching, families, herds and wagons together, toward the western edge of Roman Gaul, hoping to resettle on richer land near the Atlantic coast. Caesar does not wait for instructions from the Senate, which is months away by messenger and has given him no specific orders for this. He blocks their route, forces a diplomatic detour, then when the migration presses on anyway, he pursues it with legions raised faster than anyone expected, catching the Helvetii in a battle near Bibracte that ends with a negotiated surrender and the survivors sent back toward their original homeland rather than allowed to settle where they pleased. It is, on its face, a defensive action protecting Rome's allies from a mass movement of armed foreigners. It is also, immediately and without much subtlety, the opening chapter of what will become the 8-year Gallic War, a conquest Caesar was never formally authorized to carry out, and never really stopped once it started. Within the same year, Caesar turns against Ariovistus, a Germanic king who has crossed the Rhine into Gaul at the invitation of a local tribe, and then made himself dangerously permanent, demanding tribute and hostages from tribes Rome considers its own sphere of influence. Caesar defeats him in a hard-fought battle, driving the survivors back across the Rhine, and frames the entire campaign, in the reports he sends home, as Rome protecting its Gallic allies from a foreign invader, a framing that happens to also justify every acre of new territory his legions now occupy. These reports matter enormously, because Caesar is not simply fighting a war, he is narrating one. Each winter he writes up an account of that year's campaign, later gathered into a work historians call his commentaries on the Gallic War, and has copies circulated in Rome. The prose is famously plain and unadorned, written in the third person as though someone else were describing Caesar's decisions, and it is also a masterwork of political self-promotion, disguised as a dry military report, keeping his name and his victories in front of Roman voters every single year he is away from the city that elects its officials. The following year, 57 BC, Caesar turns north against the Belgae, a confederation of tribes in what is now northern France and Belgium, in some of the hardest fighting of the war so far. At one crossing of the river Sabis, his legions are caught in a surprise attack by the Nervi, a tribe famous even among the Belgae for their ferocity, and for a dangerous stretch of the battle the outcome hangs entirely in doubt before Roman discipline and reinforcement turn it back into a decisive victory. Caesar's own account claims the Nervii were nearly wiped out as a fighting people that day, their elders afterwards sending envoys to surrender and beg for the survivors to be spared. Whether the destruction was quite as total as the commentaries claim, later historians are less sure, since Caesar had every reason to overstate the completeness of his victories, but the pattern across these years is not in doubt. Tribe after tribe across Gaul is defeated, subdued or absorbed into an expanding Roman sphere, and Caesar's legions, tested repeatedly in real combat rather than idle garrison duty, grow into one of the most experienced fighting forces Rome has ever fielded. Back in Rome, the money and prestige flowing out of Gaul buys Caesar exactly what he intended it to buy. The Senate grants an unprecedented 15 days of public thanksgiving for his victories over the Belgae, a mark of honour beyond anything given to a living general in living memory. Debts he could never have repaid from an aedile's salary get settled from Gallic plunder. Soldiers who serve under him in these hard early campaigns become soldiers who will, a decade later, follow him into a war against Rome itself rather than abandon him, because by then they will owe their land, their savings, and in many cases their lives to a general who has proven, campaign after campaign, that he does not waste them carelessly and does share what he wins. In 56 BC, with unrest brewing back in Rome over the arrangement, and Cato's allies muttering about recalling Caesar early, the three men of the alliance meet again, this time at the town of Lucca in Supine Gaul, close enough for Caesar to attend in person without leaving his province. Pompey and Crassus travel to him rather than the other way around, a small but telling detail about which of the three now holds the most leverage. They renew their pact. Pompey and Crassus will share the consulship again for 55 BC and arrange for Caesar's Gallic command to be extended a further 5 years, keeping him supplied with troops, funding and legal cover through the end of the decade. It buys Caesar time he badly needs, because Gaul, for all the victories claimed so far, is nowhere near as settled as the commentaries suggest, and further north and west, tribes who have watched Rome's legions with growing alarm are beginning to talk to each other about resistance, rather than accommodation. In the late summer of 55 BC, Roman soldiers stand crowded in transport ships, off an unfamiliar coastline, watching British warriors and chariots gathering on the cliffs above a landing beach, and Caesar has brought them here less because Britain offers any pressing strategic necessity than because no Roman general has ever led an army across that stretch of sea before, and being first carries its own kind of value back home. The landing itself is difficult, the ships too deep-drafted to reach shallow water, soldiers forced to jump into the surf under a hail of British spears and arrows before finally forcing a beachhead. It is a short, largely inconclusive expedition, cut further short by storms that damage the fleet and by the lateness of the season, and Caesar withdraws to Gaul within weeks, having gained little beyond hostages and a claim of submission that the tribes involved treat as barely binding. He returns the next year, in 54 BC, with a much larger force, pushes further inland, crosses the River Thames, and extracts a more substantial settlement from a British chieftain named Cassivellaunus, but he still leaves no permanent garrison and no lasting occupation. Britain will not become a real Roman province for another century. What matters to Caesar in 55 and 54 BC is not the island itself, but the report that goes back to Rome afterward, describing a Roman army crossing the edge of the known world, and the report lands exactly as intended, adding to a growing sense in the city that this general's ambition has simply outgrown the province the Senate originally handed him. Between the two British expeditions, Caesar also bridges the Rhine into Germanic territory, a feat of military engineering his own commentaries describe in careful, almost boastful detail, and campaigns briefly against tribes east of the river before withdrawing again. Having made the point that Rome could reach them whenever it chose rather than committing to holding ground there permanently. It is characteristic of these middle years of the war, less a steady expansion of fixed territory than a series of demonstrations, each one calibrated to keep Caesar's name circulating in Rome, as a man who does what no one else has dared attempt, on rivers and coastlines that most senators back home have never seen and can barely picture. The alliance holding Caesar's political position together in Rome, meanwhile, is coming apart at exactly the moment he can least afford it. In 54 BC, his daughter Julia, married to Pompey for the last 5 years in a match that has genuinely warmed into something closer to real affection between the two men, despite the political calculation behind it, dies giving birth to a child who does not survive her by long. It is a personal loss for Caesar and a structural one for the alliance. The blood tie holding Pompey to Caesar's family is simply gone, and nothing yet has replaced it. The following year, 53 BC, Crassus, never content to be remembered only as Rome's richest man rather than one of its great generals, leads a large Roman army into Parthia, the powerful empire controlling Mesopotamia and Persia, seeking the military glory that has always eluded him. At the Battle of Carrhae, his legions are destroyed by Parthian horse archers and armoured cavalry using tactics Roman infantry has no good answer for, and Crassus himself is killed in the retreat, reportedly beheaded. His head sent to the Parthian king as a trophy. The Roman standards lost that day will not be recovered for a generation. With Julia dead and Crassus dead within a year of each other, the arrangement that has protected Caesar's position for 6 years is reduced to 2 men, Caesar and Pompey, with no remaining family bond and an increasingly wide gap between where each man is standing. Pompey is in Rome, close to the Senate, remarried now into one of Rome's most traditional and conservative families, and drifting, year by year, toward the men who have always distrusted Caesar rather than away from them. Caesar is still in Gaul, still fighting, still winning, but increasingly aware that every victory he wins there is buying him less protection back home than it used to, because the very success of the Gallic War is starting to frighten the same Senate that once quietly hoped it would either kill him or wear him out. It does neither. What it produces instead, in the winter of 53 into 52 BC, is the opposite of exhaustion. A Gaul that has watched Rome's legions march through every corner of its territory for 5 years, has lost enormous numbers of men and women to war and slavery in that time, and is finally, for the first time, close to uniting behind a single leader rather than fighting Rome tribe by exhausted tribe. Caesar has spent 5 years teaching Gaul unintentionally the one lesson that could actually threaten him there, that a Rome distracted by its own internal politics can be beaten if enough of Gaul finally agrees to fight it together instead of separately. In the winter of 52 BC, a young nobleman of the Arverni tribe named Vercingetorix does something almost no Gallic leader has managed in 5 years of war. He persuades rival tribes, old enemies of each other for generations, to put aside their feuds and fight Rome as one coordinated people, rather than as isolated resistance. His strategy is deliberately unglamorous. Rather than meeting Roman legions in open battle, where Roman discipline and engineering usually win, he orders towns and granaries burned ahead of Caesar's advance, denying the Romans the supplies they depend on foraging from the countryside, and he pulls his own forces back to strongly fortified hill towns the Gauls call Oppida, daring Caesar to besiege them at heavy cost rather than fight in the open. The strategy nearly works at the hill town of Gergovia, in the heart of Arverni territory. Caesar's assault on the town's defences is repulsed with heavy Roman casualties, one of the few clear tactical defeats of the entire Gallic War, and Caesar himself, in the commentaries, is unusually candid about the scale of the loss, a rare admission from a general whose reports otherwise read like an unbroken run of triumphs. It is a real setback, not a minor one, and for a short window afterward, the initiative genuinely belongs to Vercingetorix rather than to Rome. Vercingetorix then makes a decision that will define the rest of the war. Rather than press the advantage in the open, he withdraws his main force into the hill fortress of Alesia, a naturally strong position surrounded by rivers and steep slopes, intending to wait out a siege while allied Gallic tribes gather a relief army from across the country to trap Caesar between the fortress and the relief force. It is a sound plan against most Roman generals of the era. Against Caesar, whose engineering skill has been on display since the Rhine Bridge and the campaigns of previous years, it invites one of the most remarkable feats of siege warfare in ancient history. Caesar's legions build a ring of fortifications completely encircling Alesia, roughly 10 miles around, cutting Vercingetorix's forces off from any supply or escape. Then, learning that a massive Gallic relief army is indeed approaching from outside, Caesar orders a second ring built facing outward, several miles further out, so that his own army now sits sandwiched between 2 enemy forces inside a double wall of its own construction, trenches, spiked obstacles, and watchtowers on both faces at once. It is an almost absurd gamble on paper, a Roman army besieging a town while itself besieged from behind, and it holds. When the relief army finally attacks the outer wall in force, trying to break through and link up with Vercingetorix's men attacking simultaneously from inside, Caesar's legions hold both lines, and a final, desperate combined assault is broken by a cavalry charge. Caesar personally leads around the flank at the crisis point of the fighting. The relief army disperses, its coalition unable to survive the failure. Trapped, starving, with no further hope of rescue, Vercingetorix surrenders. Roman accounts describe him riding out alone to lay his weapons and armour at Caesar's feet in a formal gesture of submission. Though how much of the ceremony's drama is later Roman embellishment rather than exact record is impossible to know for certain. He is taken to Rome as a prisoner, held for years, and eventually killed as part of the ritual conclusion to one of Caesar's later triumphal processions, a fate typical for defeated enemy leaders paraded through the city under Roman custom. Alesia effectively ends organised Gallic resistance to Roman conquest, though scattered fighting continues into the following year. What Caesar has built by 51 BC is staggering in scope. A new Roman province covering nearly all of modern France and Belgium, secured by roughly 8 years of near-continuous warfare, funded and supplied largely through the plunder and slave markets that conquest itself generated, and defended by an army of legions who have now fought together, under the same commander, longer and harder than almost any force in Roman history. Contemporary estimates of the war's human cost, drawn from ancient sources, and treated by modern historians as almost certainly inflated but still suggestive of real scale, describe enormous numbers killed or enslaved across the whole conflict. Caesar returns from the double walls of Alesia not just a conqueror, but the commander of the single most seasoned, most personally loyal fighting force in the entire Roman world, at the exact moment Rome's Senate has finally decided that force has grown too dangerous to leave where it is. Back in Rome in the winter of 51 BC, a consul named Marcus Claudius Marcellus stands before the Senate and formally proposes that Caesar be recalled from Gaul and stripped of his command before his term legally ends, arguing that the Gallic War is effectively won and there is no remaining justification for one man to hold an army of that size for a day longer than necessary. It is not really about Gaul. Vercingetorix's surrender the previous year has made the military argument for keeping Caesar in command genuinely weaker, but the men pushing hardest for his recall, Cato the Younger foremost among them, have wanted him gone since long before Alesia, since the forced land bill of his consulship, since the day he had Cato dragged out of the Senate chamber. What has changed is that Pompey, still nominally Caesar's ally, is no longer willing to block the recall effort the way he once might have. Pompey's own position in Rome has shifted considerably. In 52 BC, chronic street violence between rival political gangs, one loyal to the radical tribune Clodius and another to his rival Milo, boiled over when Clodius was killed outright in a roadside brawl, and the resulting riots grew severe enough that the Senate, in an unprecedented move, appointed Pompey sole consul for the year with no colleague at all, trusting only him to restore order. Pompey did restore it, efficiently and with visible force, and the experience seems to have shown him, and shown the Senate, that Rome's traditional constitutional structure of two co-equal consuls checking each other was not equal to a genuine crisis. He remarries into the deeply conservative Metelli family, drawing him socially and politically closer to exactly the senators who have spent a decade distrusting Caesar, and by 51 BC, he is no longer defending his old ally so much as quietly weighing whether Caesar's continued command still serves his own interests better than Caesar's removal would. Caesar, watching all of this from Gaul through a network of allies and informants in Rome, understands with total clarity what is actually at stake in the recall debate. Roman law grants a serving magistrate legal immunity from prosecution for actions taken in office. The moment Caesar's command ends and he becomes a private citizen again, without an army and without immunity, his enemies in the Senate led by Cato are certain to prosecute him for exactly the kind of conduct that defined his consulship a decade earlier. The forced land bill, the arrest of Bibulus attendants, arguably even the entire unauthorized invasion of Gaul itself. A conviction could mean exile or worse. Caesar's entire political survival now depends on either holding his command and its legal protection continuously until he can stand for a second consulship, whose office would grant him the same immunity all over again, or finding some other way to walk back into Roman civic life, without a gap of vulnerability in between. Through 51 and 50 BC, a running legal and procedural battle plays out over exactly this question, with Caesar's allies in the Senate, particularly a forceful young tribune named Gaius Scribonius Curio, using every procedural tool available, including the tribunician veto, to block any measure that would strip Caesar of his command before a replacement arrangement is agreed. Curio proposes, at one point, that both Caesar and Pompey give up their commands simultaneously, a genuinely even-handed compromise that briefly wins wide support in the Senate, since most senators have no personal stake in humiliating Caesar so much as they fear either man holding an army alone. The proposal collapses when it becomes clear neither Pompey nor the hardliners around Cato are willing to accept Pompey standing down at the same moment, and the moment for compromise, such as it was, passes. By the autumn of 50 BC, the language on both sides has hardened past the point where a negotiated settlement looks realistic. Caesar offers, more than once, to give up most of his legions and provinces if he is guaranteed the consulship and legal protection in return, offers that reasonable observers at the time note were genuinely conciliatory by the standards of the conflict. But the Senate's hardliners, increasingly confident that Pompey's legions in Italy could handle Caesar's if it came to actual war, refuse every version of the compromise. On the 1st of January 49 BC, the Senate passes what is called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, its most extreme emergency measure, in effect declaring Caesar's continued command illegal and authorizing the state to treat him as an enemy if he does not disband his army immediately. Curio and another tribune, a young ally of Caesar's named Mark Antony, flee Rome that same night and ride for Caesar's camp in Cisalpine Gaul, no longer safe in a city that has just voted, in all but name, for war. On a January night in 49 BC, Caesar stands on the northern bank of a small, unremarkable river called the Rubicon, the boundary marking where his legal command ends and Italy proper, forbidden to any general leading an army under arms, begins. He has with him, for the moment, only a single legion, the 13th, veterans of 8 years in Gaul, the rest of his army still strung out behind on the roads from further north. Crossing this river with troops still armed is, under Roman law, an act of treason with no ambiguity attached to it whatsoever. There is no clever legal argument available, no procedural loophole, only the plain fact of soldiers stepping from one bank to the other. Plutarch and Suetonius, writing more than a century later, both describe Caesar hesitating on the bank for some time before finally giving the order, and Suetonius records him quoting, in Greek, a line from a Menander play, roughly meaning that the matter is now committed beyond recall, a remark that later becomes fixed in popular memory in its Latin form, the die is cast, though no contemporary source confirms the exact words spoken. Whatever he actually said, the decision behind it had been building for years, not minutes. Caesar knows precisely what he is choosing between. Return to Rome without his army and stand trial before a Senate that has already shown, in the recall debate, exactly how it intends to treat him once his immunity lapses, or cross the river with the one force in the Roman world personally loyal enough to follow him into outright civil war. He chooses the river. The 13th Legion crosses behind him, and by the time news reaches Rome, Caesar is already moving south through Italy at a pace that catches everyone off guard. Town after town along his route opening its gates without resistance rather than face a siege from an army whose reputation, after 8 years of Gallic victories, precedes it everywhere it goes. The Senate's confidence that Pompey's legions in Italy could simply crush any move Caesar made turns out to have badly misjudged the readiness of those forces. Many of Pompey's soldiers in Italy are new recruits, untested, scattered across garrison towns rather than concentrated into a single field army. Nothing like the hardened veteran force marching south under Caesar. Pompey, faced with the prospect of fighting a defensive battle in Italy, with troops he does not yet trust, makes the difficult call to abandon the peninsula entirely, withdrawing south to the port of Brundisium. And from there, in March of 49 BC, evacuating across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, taking with him most of the sitting Senate, both consuls, and everything that constitutes the Republic's legally constituted government in exile. It is a stunning reversal. Within roughly 2 months of crossing a river with a single legion, Caesar controls the entire Italian peninsula, including the city of Rome itself, without having fought a single major battle to take it. He enters Rome not as a conqueror sacking a captured city, but deliberately as a magistrate restoring order, careful in these early weeks to project moderation rather than vengeance, sparing captured enemy officers, releasing them on parole rather than executing them, a policy of studied clemency that will remain one of the most consistent features of his conduct through the entire civil war, and one that genuinely wins him support from Romans, exhausted by the memory of Sulla's proscriptions a generation earlier. He takes what money remains in the public treasury, over the objection of a tribune who tries and fails to physically block him from it, and turns immediately to the larger problem the flight to Greece has created. Pompey, most of the Senate, and a substantial fleet are now regrouping across the Adriatic, and several Pompeian provinces, Spain chief among them, still hold armies loyal to the Senate's cause, rather than to the man now sitting in Rome uninvited. Caesar has crossed one river. He now faces the much larger problem of an empire's worth of provinces, fleets and armies still deciding which side of that river they actually stand on. And he understands, better than almost anyone else on either side of the coming war, that the crossing itself settled nothing except which direction the fighting would now move. While Pompey regroups in Greece, gathering ships, legions from the eastern provinces, and the loyalty of most of the Roman world's client kings, Caesar makes a decision that puzzles some of his own officers at the time. Rather than chase Pompey immediately across the Adriatic, he turns first towards Spain, where the largest Pompeian army still standing anywhere in the war, 7 legions strong, sits under 2 experienced legates named Afranius and Petreius. Caesar's reasoning is straightforward even if the itinerary looks strange. Leaving a major hostile army in Spain at his back while he pursues Pompey east risks being cut off from Italy and Gaul entirely if that army ever moves. Better to eliminate the threat closer to home first. On the way to Spain, Caesar's route passes the city of Massilia, modern Marseille, a wealthy Greek-founded port that has decided, against Caesar's hopes for a quiet passage, to shut its gates and side openly with Pompey. Caesar leaves part of his force behind under a trusted subordinate to besiege the city rather than delay his own march, and Massilia holds out for months in a siege marked by fierce naval engagements in the harbour as well as land assault, eventually surrendering later in the year, stripped of much of its former independence as punishment. Though Caesar again shows the same relative restraint that has marked his treatment of defeated enemies throughout the war, sparing the city outright destruction. In Spain itself, the campaign against Afranius and Petreius near the town of Ilerda becomes less a matter of decisive battle than of manoeuvre, engineering and logistics, Caesar's legions repeatedly outflanking and outsupplying the Pompeian force through a combination of bold river crossings and rapid fortification work until the larger enemy army, cut off from reliable water and forage, is essentially starved into surrender without a single major pitched battle ever being fought. It is, by Caesar's own later account, and by most modern assessments, one of the most skillfully bloodless victories of his entire career, 7 legions removed from the war than through manoeuvre rather than slaughter. And Caesar again releases the defeated soldiers rather than executing them or forcing them into his own ranks against their will, a mercy that costs him little and buys him considerable goodwill across a province he will need to hold quietly for years to come. With Spain secured and Massilia falling soon after, Caesar returns briefly to Rome, where he has himself appointed dictator for a short term under an emergency procedure mainly to legally preside over consular elections and stabilize the currency and courts during the extended absence of the ordinary Senate, then resigns the dictatorship after only 11 days once the immediate administrative business is done, a detail worth noting because it shows at this stage of the war Caesar still treating even his most extraordinary powers as temporary tools rather than a permanent arrangement, a restraint that will not hold in the years to come. By late 48 BC, having spent nearly a year securing the western half of the Roman world, Caesar finally turns to Pompey directly, gathering ships and slipping legions across the Adriatic in difficult winter conditions that Pompey's much larger fleet fails to intercept in time. The 2 armies spend weeks manoeuvring around each other in Greece, Caesar at one point attempting an ambitious siege line around Pompey's coastal camp near Dyrrhachium that ultimately fails and forces a costly, difficult retreat, one of the closer calls of Caesar's entire military career, and a moment where a less experienced or less lucky commander might well have lost his army outright. Pompey, cautious by nature and initially inclined to wear Caesar down, through delay and attrition rather than risk a decisive battle, comes under mounting pressure from the senators travelling with him, men eager for a quick, glorious end to the war and increasingly contemptuous of what they see as excessive caution from their general. Against his own better instincts, by several ancient accounts, Pompey eventually agrees to offer battle on ground of his choosing near a town called Pharsalus in central Greece, a decision that will settle, in a single afternoon, a conflict that has already spanned continents. At Pharsalus in August of 48 BC, Pompey's army outnumbers Caesar's by more than 2 to 1, and loses anyway in an afternoon. Pompey's plan relies heavily on his large cavalry advantage, intending to sweep around Caesar's exposed flank and roll up his line from behind, while the infantry holds in the centre. Caesar, anticipating exactly this, has quietly stationed a reserve line of hand-picked infantry behind his own weaker cavalry, with specific orders to use their javelins, not as thrown weapons from a distance, but as thrusting spears against the faces of the enemy cavalry once they close, a strikingly unusual tactic aimed less at killing horses than at breaking the nerve of young wealthy Roman and allied cavalrymen who, unlike Caesar's hardened Gallic war infantry, have far less experience with the brutal reality of close combat. It works exactly as intended. Pompey's cavalry breaks and flees before real contact is even fully joined, exposing the flank it was meant to protect, and Caesar's reserve wheels into the gap. Pompey's infantry, watching their own cavalry collapse, loses cohesion soon after, and what should have been a grinding battle between two roughly matched Roman armies becomes a rout. Pompey himself, watching the collapse from his camp, is, by most ancient accounts, stunned into something close to paralysis, reportedly sitting in his tent for a period rather than organising a fighting withdrawal, before finally fleeing the field with a small group of companions once the outcome is beyond doubt. He makes his way to the coast, takes ship, and after considering several possible refuges among Rome's various eastern client kingdoms, decides on Egypt, ruled at the time by the teenage pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his advisors, reasoning that past favours done for the Ptolemaic dynasty by Rome, and by Pompey personally, should guarantee him safe asylum there. The calculation proves fatally wrong. Ptolemy's court, weighing the political risk of sheltering a defeated Roman general against the potential favour of the victorious one, decides to have Pompey killed the moment he steps ashore near Alexandria in September of 48 BC, cutting him down on the beach in view of his own wife and son still aboard ship, then preserving his severed head as a grim offering intended for Caesar. Caesar arrives in Alexandria shortly after in pursuit, and by nearly every ancient account reacts to the sight of his former ally and son-in-law's head not with satisfaction but with genuine grief and disgust at the manner of the killing, a reaction some historians read as sincere personal feeling, and others read as calculated political theatre aimed at Roman opinion, given how useful it is for Caesar to be seen mourning Pompey rather than celebrating his death. Whatever the mixture of motive, Caesar's arrival drags him immediately into a separate, entirely local conflict, a succession struggle within the Ptolemaic royal family between the young Ptolemy XIII and his elder sister, Cleopatra VII, who under Egyptian and Ptolemaic custom are meant to rule jointly as siblings and spouses, but have instead fallen into open civil war against each other. Caesar, holding considerable leverage in Alexandria as the representative of a Rome that Egypt depends on diplomatically, involves himself directly in the dispute, and Cleopatra, according to a famous and probably at least partly embellished later tradition, has herself smuggled into the palace, where Caesar is staying rolled inside a carpet or bedroll, to secure a private audience with him, without her brother's faction intercepting her first. Whatever the precise theatrics of their first meeting, the political and personal alliance that follows is real and consequential. Caesar backs Cleopatra's claim. A brief but genuinely dangerous war follows against Ptolemy's forces inside and around Alexandria itself. Ptolemy XIII drowns in the Nile fleeing a lost battle, and Caesar installs Cleopatra on the throne alongside a younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as her new co-ruler and husband in name, though real power in Egypt from this point on belongs almost entirely to Cleopatra. Caesar remains in Egypt for several months, longer than the military situation strictly required, and the relationship between the two becomes intimate. A son, whom Egyptian tradition will later call Caesarion, is born to Cleopatra, though Caesar never formally acknowledges the boy as his heir under Roman law, since Roman inheritance and citizenship rules have no category for a child born to a foreign queen outside of marriage. With Egypt settled and Pompey dead, the civil war that began at the Rubicon might reasonably have been considered over. It is not. Scattered Pompeian forces and unreconciled Republican loyalists still hold significant strength across North Africa and Spain, and Caesar, delayed months in Alexandria by a war he did not originally intend to fight, now has to cross back into a Roman world where his enemies have had all that extra time to regroup, rearm, and decide that Pompey's death has not ended their cause, only changed which of them now leads it. In 47 BC, before he can even finish settling Egypt's affairs, Caesar has to deal with a second war entirely in Asia Minor, where Pharsalus II, king of Pontus and son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates, has taken advantage of Rome's civil war to seize territory from several Roman client kingdoms in the region. Caesar marches against him and defeats his army decisively at the Battle of Zela with startling speed, the entire campaign lasting only a matter of weeks from arrival to victory. He reports the outcome home in a message famous for its brevity, even by Caesar's own economical standards. 3 plain words: he came, he saw, he conquered, a line that circulates through Rome as proof, if anyone still needed it, that no theatre of war anywhere in the Roman world moves fast enough to outrun him. He returns to Rome only briefly before the war's real unfinished business pulls him away again, this time to North Africa, where the most determined and least reconcilable of his enemies have gathered the largest Republican army still in the field. Metellus Scipio, Pompey's former father-in-law and the civil war's new nominal commander for the Senate's cause, allied with the Numidian king Juba, and, present with the army though holding no formal command, Cato the Younger, Caesar's oldest and most implacable political enemy, now finally facing him with weapons rather than words. The campaign is hard fought and, for a stretch in early 46 BC, genuinely uncertain, Caesar's forces struggling with supply and unfamiliar terrain against an enemy reinforced by Numidian cavalry, and even war elephants brought in by Juba. The decisive battle comes at Thapsus, where Caesar's legions, some reportedly advancing before he even gave the formal order, overwhelm the Republican lines so completely that the battle turns into something closer to a massacre than a contest. Republican losses running far higher than Caesar's own comparatively minor casualties. Metellus Scipio dies attempting to escape by sea. Juba is later killed. Cato, holding the coastal city of Utica, chooses neither to surrender nor to flee, and instead, once the cause is unmistakably and finally lost, takes his own life rather than accept whatever clemency Caesar might have offered him. A death that instantly transforms him, for generations of Romans who cherish the memory of the old Republic, into its purest martyr, a man who would rather die than live under one man's rule, however mercifully that rule might be administered. Caesar, by several accounts, is reported to have said that Cato had robbed him of the chance to pardon him, a remark that captures, whether entirely sincere or partly performance, how central the policy of visible clemency toward defeated enemies has become to Caesar's entire political strategy by this point in the war. Rome, by the middle of 46 BC, is functionally Caesar's, and he marks the moment with an extraordinary series of 4 separate triumphal processions held over several weeks, celebrating victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus and Africa in turn, an unprecedented concentration of honours that fills the city with spectacle, distributed grain and cash to the populace, and public games on a scale even Rome, no stranger to lavish display, has never seen before. Yet the war is still not entirely finished. Pompey's 2 surviving sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, together with the capable and experienced general Titus Labienus, once one of Caesar's own most trusted legates in Gaul before defecting to Pompey's side at the outbreak of civil war, have rebuilt a substantial Republican army in Spain, and in 45 BC Caesar is forced to campaign there personally one final time. The resulting battle at Munda in March of 45 BC is by Caesar's own later admission the hardest fought and most dangerous engagement of his entire career, a close, brutal contest where the outcome hangs in genuine doubt for hours, and Caesar himself, according to Roman tradition, has to dismount and fight briefly on foot among his own wavering front line to rally it, at one point supposedly telling his officers that he had fought many times for victory, but this was the first time he had fought for his life. Rome's legions eventually break the Republican line, Labienus is killed in the fighting, and Gnaeus Pompeius is hunted down and killed shortly after the battle while attempting to flee. Only Sextus escapes, into a long guerrilla resistance that will outlast Caesar himself by years. With Munda, the civil war that began at a small river in January of 49 BC, is for all practical purposes finally over, 4 years and roughly a continent's worth of battlefields after it started, and Caesar returns to Rome not as one power broker among several but as the single undisputed master of the entire Roman world. Back in Rome for good, by the autumn of 45 BC, Caesar turns from winning a war to running a state whose ordinary institutions have not functioned as intended in years, worn down by a decade of civil conflict, debt crisis, and the collapse of any working balance between the Senate and the popular assemblies. He governs now as Dictator, an old Roman emergency office that traditionally lasted 6 months at most, granted to one man to handle a specific crisis before automatically lapsing. The Senate, first in 46 BC, and then again in early 44 BC, extends Caesar's term far beyond that tradition, first for 10 years, and finally in February of 44 BC for life, an office Rome calls Dictator Perpetuo, dictator without end, a title with no precedent and, crucially, no built-in mechanism for it ever to expire on its own. The reforms Caesar pushes through in these final years are genuinely substantial and, by most modern assessments, sensible responses to real problems rather than mere self-glorification. Rome's calendar has drifted badly out of alignment with the actual solar year through decades of political manipulation by priests who could insert extra days for their own convenience. Caesar, working with an astronomer named Sosigenes, introduces a corrected calendar of 365 days with a leap day every fourth year, a system so close to astronomically accurate that, with only minor later adjustment, it remains recognizably the calendar the world still uses today. He addresses Rome's chronic debt crisis with moderate relief measures that cancel a portion of outstanding debt and set fairer terms for the rest. Careful to avoid the more radical debt cancellation some of his populist allies had wanted, a balance calculated to relieve real suffering without alienating the creditor class entirely. He resettles large numbers of veterans and Rome's urban poor onto land in Italy and in new overseas colonies, including the refounding of Carthage and Corinth, two great cities Rome had destroyed a century earlier, now rebuilt as Roman colonies. He expands the Senate itself, admitting new members from Italian towns, and even controversially to traditionalists from provinces beyond Italy, diluting the old aristocratic monopoly on the body's membership. He commissions ambitious public building projects in Rome, a new forum bearing his own name, a grand new basilica, plans for a public library, work that will employ labourers and reshape the city's skyline for generations. Alongside the practical reforms comes an accumulation of personal honours that grows, year by year, increasingly hard to distinguish from monarchy in everything but the name. Caesar is granted the right to wear triumphal dress, including the purple robe and the laurel wreath on any public occasion, rather than only during an actual triumph, a privilege that conveniently also lets him cover his thinning hairline in public more often than not, and by this point in his life the wreath has become as recognisable a part of his public image as his name. A statue of him is placed among the statues of Rome's 7 ancient kings, in a prominent public location. His face appears on Roman coinage while he is still living, the first time any living Roman has been so honoured, breaking a tradition that had reserved coin portraits for gods and the dead. The month of his birth, Quintilis, is renamed in his honour to July, the name it still carries. At the festival of the Lupercalia in February of 44 BC, Mark Antony, now serving as Caesar's co-consul and closest lieutenant, publicly offers him a diadem, a plain white headband that in the Greek and Eastern world signals kingship, in front of a large crowd gathered in the forum. Caesar refuses it, and the crowd's reaction, by most ancient accounts, is a mixture that unsettles him, some cheering the refusals with clear relief, suggesting real popular anxiety about actual kingship, even among people who otherwise support him personally. According to several ancient writers, Antony offers the diadem more than once that day, and each time Caesar pushes it away, finally having the gesture recorded in the official calendar of state religious observances as a formal, deliberate refusal of kingship, an attempt to put the question to rest in the public record. It does not put the question to rest. Whatever Caesar's own intentions, and historians remain genuinely divided on whether he wanted the title of king itself, or was simply indifferent to titles, as long as the substance of permanent unchecked power remained his, the accumulation of honours, the lifetime dictatorship, the statue among the kings, and the coins bearing his living face, have together convinced a growing number of Rome's senators that the republic they were born into, imperfect and increasingly dysfunctional as it had already become before Caesar ever crossed the Rubicon, is now functionally finished, replaced in substance by exactly the kind of permanent one-man rule its 500-year-old constitution had been built from the beginning to prevent. In the winter of 44 BC, a Roman senator named Gaius Cassius Longinus begins a conversation he has clearly been waiting years to have, quietly approaching other senators one at a time and asking whether they would be willing to kill Caesar. Cassius has personal grievances of his own, having fought for Pompey and only been pardoned after Pharsalus, but his real recruiting strength lies in the man he approaches next. Marcus Junius Brutus, a senator with a lineage Rome remembers for a very specific reason, a distant ancestor credited with helping expel Rome's last king nearly 500 years earlier and establish the Republic in the first place. Brutus is also, by most accounts, someone Caesar has personally favoured and forgiven, having fought against him at Pharsalus and been pardoned afterward, appointed to positions of trust since. That personal debt makes Brutus' eventual recruitment to the conspiracy both harder to secure and, Once secured, far more valuable to Cassius, since a plot led visibly by Caesar's own former enemy would look like simple revenge, while one that includes a man Caesar trusted and had promoted looks instead like a principled defense of the Republic itself. Over the following weeks, the conspiracy grows to somewhere around 60 senators, an unusually large number for a plot to remain secret, drawn from men with a wide range of motives. Old Pompeians never fully reconciled to the new order, ambitious senators who feel their own careers blocked under a permanent dictatorship, and a smaller number who seem to act from genuine, old-fashioned republican conviction that no single man should hold power for life regardless of how well or badly he uses it. They settle on the 15th of March, a date the Roman calendar calls the Ides, as the day to act, because Caesar is scheduled to attend a Senate meeting at the theatre of Pompey, the Senate's temporary meeting hall while its usual chamber is being rebuilt, and crucially he is scheduled to leave for a major military campaign against Parthia. Only days later, a campaign that would take him and his most loyal legions out of Italy for years, and remove any remaining opportunity to act against him as a private citizen rather than an armed general. In the days before the Ides, warnings accumulate from several directions at once, none of them quite specific enough, or quite believed enough, to change Caesar's plans. A seer named Spurinna, according to a widely repeated later tradition, warns him generally to be on guard through the Ides of March. Caesar's wife Calpurnia reportedly has disturbing dreams the night before, and pleads with him to stay home that morning. A Greek teacher of philosophy named Artemidorus, who has apparently learned some real details of the plot, manages to press a written warning directly into Caesar's hand as he walks toward the Senate meeting that morning. But Caesar, according to the tradition, is already carrying a stack of other petitions handed to him by various citizens along the way, and simply does not read it before reaching the building. An ordinary morning's accumulation of paperwork burying the one document that might have saved him. Inside the meeting hall, the conspirators have arranged themselves so that Caesar's most reliable protector, Mark Antony, is deliberately delayed and detained outside by another senator on a pretext, keeping him from entering the chamber before the attack begins. As Caesar takes his seat, one conspirator, Lucius Tillius Cimber, approaches with a petition asking for his exiled brother's recall, and when Caesar waves him off, the other conspirators close in around him under cover of the crowd, Cimber grabbing at his toga to expose his shoulder as the first conspirator strikes with a blade. Caesar, by most accounts, tries briefly to resist and pull away, but is surrounded on all sides by men taking turns to strike, and the ancient sources describe a chaotic, poorly coordinated attack in which several of the conspirators, unpracticed at violence, wound each other by accident in the crush. Suetonius records that Caesar was struck 23 times in total, and that the physician who examined the body afterward judged that only one of those wounds to the chest had actually been fatal, the rest inflicted on a man already dying or already dead. He falls at the base of a statue of Pompey, his old ally and rival, a detail later writers found almost too fitting to be entirely accidental, though it was simply where the Senate happened to be meeting that day. The conspirators, having planned the killing with real care, but almost nothing about what should follow it, expected the Senate and the people of Rome to greet Caesar's death as a liberation, a restoration of the old republic snatched back from a would-be king. Instead, the forum and the streets around it fall into confused panic, shops closing, senators fleeing rather than gathering to celebrate, and the conspirators themselves, rather than being hailed as liberators, find themselves barricaded on the Capitoline Hill for their own safety within hours, uncertain whether the crowd outside means to thank them or tear them apart. Whatever else the Ides of March accomplished, it did not restore the republic they believed they were saving. It only removed, abruptly and violently, the one man whose personal authority had been holding the entire fractured political order together, and left every remaining faction in Rome to fight over what, if anything, should take his place. 3 days after the killing, Caesar's will is read aloud in Rome, and it changes the entire political calculation instantly. He has left the bulk of his enormous personal fortune, and formally adopted as his son and heir, not any of the conspirators, not even Mark Antony, his closest lieutenant of the last decade, but his 18-year-old great-nephew Gaius Octavius, a young man most of Rome barely knows, currently studying and training with the army in Illyricum, hundreds of miles away. Antony, presiding over Caesar's public funeral in the Forum days later, delivers a eulogy that the conspirators had permitted him to give as a gesture of reconciliation. badly misjudging what he would do with the opportunity. Antony reads Caesar's will aloud to the crowd, revealing that the dead dictator has left money directly to the ordinary people of Rome and his private gardens for public use, then displays Caesar's bloodied, torn toga for the crowd to see. The reaction is immediate and violent. The crowd, roused past any thought of the Republic, the conspirators believed they were restoring, builds an improvised funeral pyre on the spot using furniture torn from nearby buildings, and then turns on the city looking for the killers, several of the conspirators barely escaping Rome alive that same night. Octavian, arriving in Rome soon after to claim his inheritance and his adopted father's name, proves, despite his youth, a far more dangerous political operator than anyone in the city expected, systematically building his own following among Caesar's veterans by invoking the dead man's name and generosity, while manoeuvring carefully between an initially wary Antony and a Senate still hoping to use the young heir against Antony's ambitions before discarding him once Antony was checked. Within roughly 2 years, rather than let anyone use him and set him aside, Octavian instead forces his way into a formal alliance with Antony and a third figure, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, an arrangement modern historians call the Second Triumvirate, and which, unlike the loose informal pact between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus a generation earlier, is this time an openly legal, constitutionally sanctioned grant of near-absolute power, voted through by a cowed Senate. The three men mark their new authority with proscriptions of their own, published lists of political enemies to be killed and their property seized, a grim, deliberate echo of Sulla's proscriptions from the Civil War Caesar had survived as a teenager, and among the names on that list is Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, hunted down and killed on Antony's specific order. Brutus and Cassius, having fled east after the assassination, raise armies from the provinces still loyal to the old Republican cause, and the two sides meet at Philippi in Greece in 42 BC in a pair of battles that finally, decisively end any realistic hope of restoring the pre-Caesar Republic. Both Cassius and Brutus, on losing successive engagements, take their own lives rather than be captured, following the same path Cato had chosen at Utica years before, one more generation of Roman aristocrats choosing death over living under the rule, the killing of one man, had in the end only accelerated rather than prevented. The alliance between the victors does not last. Lepidus is gradually eased out of any real power within a few years. Antony, spending increasing time in the east and forming both a political and personal partnership with Cleopatra, drifts into open rivalry with Octavian, and the final contest between them is settled at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC, off the coast of Greece, where Octavian's fleet, commanded in practice by his gifted Admiral Agrippa, defeats the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra decisively. Both Antony and Cleopatra take their own lives in Alexandria the following year, rather than be paraded through Rome as captives, and Octavian, now the last man standing among all the factions that had fought over Caesar's inheritance for 13 years, returns to Rome as its unchallenged master. In 27 BC, Octavian takes the name Augustus and, with careful, deliberate political theatre, formally restores certain powers to the Senate while quietly retaining, under new and more palatable titles, every essential lever of the personal control Caesar had held. Rome calls what follows the Principate rather than a monarchy, and Augustus is scrupulously careful never to claim the title of king that had helped get his adoptive father killed. But the underlying fact is the one Caesar's enemies had killed him trying to prevent. One family, one man at a time, now holds Rome's power on a permanent basis, an arrangement that will run, with interruptions, for the next 400 years in the west and far longer in the east. The republic that stabbed Caesar to death rather than let it happen never actually came back. Somewhere in the geography of all of this, a small river in northern Italy still runs where it always has, unremarkable, easily crossed, its name recorded now only because one man once stood on its northern bank deciding whether to step across it with an army at his back. He crossed it in a matter of minutes. What it carried downstream from that single choice took the rest of his life, and then 13 years, and a continent of battlefields beyond it, before it finally reached the far shore it had been heading toward from the very start. The wreath he wore to hide a thinning head of hair became, within a generation, shorthand for supreme power itself, worn on coins and statues across an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. His own name outlasted the office he never quite dared to call kingship. Centuries later, rulers in Germany call themselves Kaiser, and rulers in Russia call themselves Tsar, both words worn down over centuries from the same 4 letters. Caesar, a private family name from a fading patrician household in a crowded Roman street. His own account of the war that made him plain, careful, written as if by an uninvolved observer, still survives, one of the few pieces of testimony from the ancient world written by the man who did the deciding rather than by someone judging him afterward. The republic he was accused of destroying had in truth already been failing for 100 years before he was born, cracking under the weight of an empire it was never built to hold, waiting only for someone willing to finish the job of unmaking it and rebuilding something else in its place. He did not set out at 19, hiding from Sulla's men in the hills, to be that someone. He simply kept choosing at every river he came to cross rather than turn back, until the last river was Rome itself, and there was no bank left on the other side to retreat to.